gear your business model to actually create rather than deplete social capital. We found that there's a direct, it was initially a correlation, and that we were able to prove it later was a causal effect between how much you create or deplete of social capital and your growth and earnings, your top and bottom line.
Right.
And that was key to unlocking being able to operationalize this as a business model, because it started to show companies that you can remove the trade-off of profit for doing some good. Because if you look at, building more trust in the community as something that's good, but it's not about making profit. If you look at those two things separately, then you're having to trade profit to create trust, right? But we
Yeah.
find that with great trust in these communities, you actually get an outcome that benefits your top and bottom line. So
Yeah.
you don't have to trade it off. And that's absolutely revolutionary, I think.
And welcome to another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Jakub. He is the leader of the Economics of Mutuality Alliance, based in Geneva, Switzerland. He's also the chief of staff of the Economics of Mutuality Alliance's consulting and private equity arm, and he's the executive director of their foundation. He's written books on co-authored books on the Economics of Mutuality Alliance. He's also co-authored the book, which I was listening to before we came onto the podcast, Completing Capitalism. I've also watched a bunch of the YouTube videos that are out there where you talk about the principles of the Economics of Mutuality or Economics of Mutuality. So it's with great pleasure to welcome you to the show, Jay.
Thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to your audience.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it. So, for those who don't know you, let's just start with you, Jay. I'm always interested in getting to know you before we dive into what you've got to say about economics. Where are you from? Give us a sense of your early life and what shaped you, and ultimately how did you get interested in this topics of economics?
Sure. Well, oddly enough, I was born in a otherwise nondescript town in northern New Jersey in the United States called Rahway, which just happens to be the hometown of Milton Friedman, the creator of the Chicago School of Business and Financial Capitalism. So I feel in a way that I'm connected in that sense to see if we can create a more complete form of capitalism and what it is we're doing. But I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I had been working for Mars Incorporated since the start of 2007, a large iconic food and beverage company that happens to be headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area, and very family-owned, privately held, eclectic, kind of eccentric food and beverage company, the maker of things like M&Ms and Snickers, and also lots of the pet foods that you may feed your dogs or cats around the world. Really unique kind of place to work. Massive company with a footprint all over the world, and yet run almost like it's out of the kitchen in your house, where everybody seems to know each other. And I had an opportunity to spend about 14 years in the global headquarters, so we got a chance to be exposed to the family and help the chief economist lead the internal think tank, which helped deliver what we're going to talk about today, this Economics of Mutuality. I've been married for almost 40 years now, and I have two adopted kids who are just wonderful young adults, and currently live in South Florida now. Recently,
Nice.
relocated.
You've moved to warmer climes.
Yes, but I help lead this Economics Mutuality organization, and do a lot of it virtually or through traveling, because our headquarters, as you mentioned, is based in Geneva in Switzerland.
Yeah. Wow. I tell you what, just as you say that, I can't help recalling the ad, a Mars a day helps you work, rest, and play. Yeah, the Mars bars were a big treat for us as kids growing up. Does the Mars bars still exist?
They sure do, and actually, Mars bars. Most people don't realize this, but it's a reformulated version of the Milky Way bar, but using ingredients that were available in the UK in the 1930s. You couldn't get all the same ingredients in the UK as you could in the US. And Mars allowed us to actually spin out as an organization in August of 2020. So right in the teeth of COVID, we went out on our own, but with some support from Mars, both for our foundation in terms of their donations, and also with Mars as a major client. So we've been independent, I should say, for a little over 4 years now as an independent organization.
So And this is the Economics of Mutuality Alliance is a spin-off of Mars, and Mars is a major client.
Right, right. The internal think tank of Mars, which had been around since the 1960s, called Catalyst, which was a really unique kind of internal think tank. We were never able to benchmark it against any other company's kind of internal operation, but it was a creation of the founder of Mars, Forrest Mars Sr., who in the 60s he thought there really needed to be a unit inside the company that had a ring fence budget and an open ended remit to do nothing but really challenge orthodox business thinking with kind of step change ideas. So the bar for our unit was extremely high. Our team was very unusual. We used to say that the only thing we had in common with one another was we had nothing in common with one another by design, because we
Right.
wanted to bring in all different kinds of disciplines into the unit. But everything that we would do would have to be potentially breakthrough or transformational for the organization. So we even had a failure metric, as odd as that sounds for business, where if we didn't fail enough, we didn't get our full bonuses. And that was because you needed to have the incentive to really take big risks if you're going to do things that are transformational. Otherwise, you'll just do things that are low risk and you'll never come up with anything really unique or breakthrough. So it was a wonderful place to work. I was there, as I mentioned, for about 14 years in the global headquarters, and I couldn't have thought up a better job, at least for my own personality, and a better culture to work in. So we're still very close to Mars. They're a major client of ours and supporter, and some of their people actually, some of their leaders help govern our organization, but we are independent of Mars, and we have clients that are outside the Mars sphere of influence, so to speak.
Right. Got it. So back in the Catalyst days, right? It was called Catalyst, this the think tank when it was within Mars. What were some of the things you got up to? Like what are the highlights of your time there in terms of the experiments and things you tried?
Well, we typically had 2 to 3, what we called laboratories, at any given time working on different solutions. One of our laboratories that kind of put us on the map with the, more contemporary leadership of Mars was something called Marketing Lab, and that, was developed really to try to put some science and prediction around, advertising spend. Advertising spend being, one of the biggest, lines of spending in every company, and yet as the former Mars CEO Paul Michaels used to say is that I spend all this on advertising and only half of it is impactful, but I don't know which half. Meaning we really have no idea what it is that we're doing in advertising. So we actually created a scientific methodology that really cracked the code and was able to be very predictive and save the company hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising spend. So that was one of the real breakthrough capabilities that came out of Catalyst. We also had an organizational culture laboratory that reported into me for some time, and that was also a unique capability, working with some of the academic godfathers of this, like Edgar Schein and John von Manen.
Oh, you worked with
Others.
Edgar Schein.
We did actually, the late Edgar
Wow.
Schein, right? And we created a capability just as Mars was heading off on a binge of acquisitions of other companies and was really in a growth spurt, a massive growth spurt that came through these acquisitions. The CEO again, he said had been looking at a lot of management literature and came to us and said, I noticed that something like 70 or 80% of all of the value of acquisitions is typically squandered. It's lost in the integration process, and maybe some of this has to do with forcing the culture of the company you're acquiring to adopt the culture of the company that is acquiring you. And maybe there's some better way to do this. So we set off to kind of create this methodology that we built on Edgar Schein and John von Manen's kind of approach to, artifacts, things you can see, espoused values, things that you say
Mm.
in a corporation that are give you more of a clue as to what you mean, and then what are your underlying assumptions that are buried way down there that are harder to discern. But if you can crack the code and really understand that company cultures that you're acquiring actually bring some really unique things, the kind of special sauce that bring value. You don't have to make them the same as your culture. You don't have to subordinate them. You can preserve a lot more value by allowing them some cultural freedom, maybe adopting some of those practices, and only breaking off the parts of the culture of the acquired company when they really are against your principles. And so it was a very unique kind of capability, and we did quite a lot. And strategy was also something we could help enable, because most companies, when they develop a strategy, it's in ignorance of their own cultural enablers and obstacles to that culture. So if you create a new strategy and it fails, it's often because the culture spat you out But if you
Mm.
actually thought out what the enablers of your strategy would be from a culture perspective, you could actually build strategies that are much more likely to stick. So we did a lot of that work too.
Well, that's very insightful, isn't it? That we should create strategy as an expression of existing strands in the culture,
Yes.
not strategy that requires a change in culture. That
The
seems very wise.
cultures
Yeah.
can't be changed very easily. They kind of
Mm.
either have to die or they live on, but they seldom adapt. So yeah, it's a different process.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And so interesting how, very often when I think about the strategy processes I've been involved in, they're very much done as intellectual, numbers-driven exercises, completely divorced from considerations of culture. That's for the implementation team to worry about, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. Um, so obviously now you've got a much broader purview. We're talking about economics in general, and I'm fascinated by this topic. And we've had Raj Sisodia on the show, who obviously wrote the book Conscious Capitalism, and other thinkers who are concerned with the current state of capitalism and how we might change it. So perhaps we should start with the current state of financial capitalism. And I know you refer to this idea of financial capitalism, the era we're currently in. So should we start there? What do we mean by financial capitalism? What's good about it, and what's the problem with it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, financial capitalism is a model really to deal with a form of scarcity that existed at the time it was introduced, which was there was a chronic lack of money in the global economy. So in 1970, Milton Friedman, and kind of the leading economist of the Chicago School of Business, created metrics and management practices that he eventually called financial capitalism. And then that model was introduced in 1970, and it then went on to create just a massive amount of global wealth, and it's probably still the dominant uh, business model that's taught in all business schools around the world, and the dominant model that still is adopted by or utilized by almost all corporations around the world. And yet, over the course of the 54, I want to say, years or so, yeah, 54, almost 55 years of financial capitalism, the world has changed. The context has changed in some sense because of the successes of financial capital in addressing that form of scarcity. So basically, financial capitalism, which has metrics and management practices only to really manage, measure, and mobilize one form of capital, which is money, um, was so good at creating money, massive amounts of money, which then was accumulated by fewer and fewer people over time. It sort of flooded the global economy with too much money. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where there's kind of way too much financial capital in the system. And what happens when you have such a surplus of anything? It loses value. So money now is used to be underpinned by gold. Some countries have tried to underpin it by a basket of commodities, but that hasn't really taken root around the world yet. And so money really isn't underpinned by anything of value other than the trust that people have in the fact that it has value. So therefore, it's an extremely it is extremely fragile sort of form of value that at any time there could be a global crisis of some kind, crisis of confidence that causes financial capital to radically lose its actual value. And when that happens, our proposition is that there are other forms of capital that are in the management literature that are called non-financial forms of capital, social, human, and natural capital, that because they're complex to measure, maybe companies have been reluctant to try to crack the code on can you measure, manage, and mobilize those forms of capital. So they've largely ignored them because in business, they say the old adage is you only manage what you measure. And if you only have metrics to measure, to manage and measure one form of capital, that's all you're going to do. And you're basically going to leave a tremendous amount of value that's inherent in social, human, and natural capital and available to business to make available to stakeholders as well as their shareholders. Then you're really operating suboptimally. And you're also creating a company that's increasingly fragile and is undertaking an excessive amount of risk if there is a collapse of the value of money for whatever reason. If there's a crisis of confidence or run on the banks, and then suddenly money is worth a lot less than it was before, those companies that are not intentionally measuring, managing, and mobilizing all four forms of capital at their disposal, they're going to be disadvantaged significantly. So we're really trying to help companies understand that you can capture, you can measure, manage, and mobilize social, human, and natural capital in ways that are not dissimilar to financial capital. And you actually can create a lot more what we call mutual value that is available to stakeholders in your ecosystem. Every business has an ecosystem. Stakeholders are necessary to actually achieve the purpose of a company. And you can actually remunerate those stakeholders with value that comes from these other forms of capital as well, and make a much more resilient company as a result that can be even more profitable and have a higher level of growth than you would if you were only trying to maximize your profit with financial capital.
Right. And presumably there's quite a lot of pushback when you present this to shareholders of companies, and I suppose what we're referring to here, I suppose, well, hang on, let me ask a different question. Is financial capitalism synonymous with shareholder capitalism? Is that the same thing?
Yes, I would pretty much define it similarly. If you're talking
Yeah.
about maximizing shareholder returns, that's what financial capital is doing.
Yeah. And shareholders generally want financial returns. They're not really interested in any other return. So it's
Exactly, but there may be a limit to how much you can squeeze out of your value chain. And in fact, when we started on this work called the economics of mutuality, we had an enlightened shareholder, one of the three Mars family members that owns all of the company, which has grown massively. I was just reading in Forbes, I think, the other day that the company is now worth about $120 billion on paper. I can remember when it was more like 30, So it's really really valuable. But this one Mars family owner came in as a shareholder, and he asked a question of his CEO at the time that no shareholders really ask in the world dominated by financial capitalism, which was, what should the right level of profit be for the company? Because it's assumed generally in financial capitalism that the right level of profit is as much as you can possibly squeeze out of your value chain. But in answering your question, I think this particular Mars family member was thinking um, more expansively and was thinking that maybe there's an optimum level of profit above which you may take too much from your value chain partners and keep for yourself. And by doing that, you create a squeezing effect among your value chain partners. They squeeze one another. It creates this kind of operational disequilibrium that disadvantages the company, but you never see it coming. And so, trying to find this optimum level of profit was the starting point that opened the door and allowed us to kind of do work in this area. And interestingly, we did a lot of research on this, and we didn't find anything in the management literature of the 50 years of financial capitalism at the time that asked this question in a meaningful way and provided any clues as to what the answer would be. But when we went back 3,000 years, literally 3,000 years, we
uh
found something by the wise King Solomon in 950 BC, where he wrote, "One may give one may give freely, and still wealth will be increased, and another may keep back more than is right, but comes to be in need." I find that really profound, and I find that
mm,
that's really at the heart of the question of what's the right level of profit. People have been wrestling with that forever.
yeah.
It's not a new question; it's an old question.
Right. And so, how does that question then relate to the idea of measuring different types of capital? So, yeah, if I'm asking the question, what's the right amount of profit? Is how does that interrelate to how do I measure other forms of capital?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think when we first took a look at this problem, because the chief economist of Mars was in charge of the think tank, that naturally you focused on measurement first before
Mm,
anything else. And so we started to look at what are the value creation opportunities for corporations, and we realized that actually there are these four forms of capital. But why is it that we don't measure, manage, and mobilize social, human, and natural capital? What kind of a value is inherent in them? If we were able to crack that and measure of social, human, and natural capital with a small number of metrics in a way that was scientifically robust, that could be backed by a management theory. So we partnered with a lot of academic institutions, especially Oxford in your own country. They're
yeah, I know you referenced Sayed Business School.
yeah,
Yeah,
they've been a partner of ours for maybe 15 years or
mm,
so, especially Colin Mayer, who was one of their early deans, has been a great collaborator in all of this work all the way. And so that's how we kind of landed on, well, let's start with measurement. Since you only manage what you measure in business, let's think about how we can create a means by which businesses can expand their definition of performance, because ultimately the question of what's the right level of profit is tied to your performance. Where is it coming from, and the level of your performance. Interestingly, we found early on that in the case of the company that we were based in initially, no matter what business activity and what business unit and what market, it was always pretty much the same percentage level of profitability for the company. They were taking about the same amount of profit in every situation, and we realized, why is that? And are there areas in which maybe the company is justified at taking more profit, and maybe where the ecosystems of business are more fragile, should they be taking less profit? In working with value chains that are actually more robust, more um, able to sustain shocks in the system over time, because guaranteeing your supply chain, especially for a manufacturing company that relies on a lot of raw materials, is critically important. So why should you have an arbitrary amount of percentage of profit for every single activity you do? And ultimately, the answer we found was one that probably isn't going to be satisfying, which is it depends. It depends really on the circumstance. And the bigger question is there a way in which you could harness all of these four forms of value creation, and through mutual value creation, can you expand the definition of performance, expand the pie, and deliver through measurable impact more holistic returns that also enable you to deliver greater top and bottom line as well, your profit and growth, in addition to driving positive impact that can help solve problems in the world.
Yeah, and that's the orientation I've often heard, is that for people who invest in social natural capital, uh, and 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 people capital, right? If they make those investments, then they're profitable. They become more profitable, right? It's not at the expense of profit. Uh,
Yep.
it's just
That's what we find, but
yeah,
that's
right.
not the widespread, and that's not the widespread belief. The widespread belief is still that if you want to do good for society or the environment, for example, then you have to trade profit to do some good for people and planet. And unfortunately, that way of thinking leads us to make our giving more about philanthropy and
Yeah,
altruism, when in actual fact, it makes good business sense. And there's a way in which you can actually, instead of just focusing on how do you do less bad at a cost and being very inwardly focused, which is the vast majority of companies that work in this so-called stakeholder capitalism space, uh, as opposed to shareholder capitalism, uh, they're focused more on how can we do less bad at a cost. And that's where you find like corporate social responsibility, circular
yeah,
economy, ESG, you find those kinds of initiatives, sustainability. Those are really important things to do. Companies, don't get me wrong, companies need to do less bad, and they have to invest in doing less bad. But when you're the CFO of a company, and when you're the shareholder of the company, holding the CFO accountable for delivering returns, there's only so much that even enlightened investors are going to allow the CFO to trade profit to do some good for people and planet. And what we're finding is that there's this greenfield part of the stakeholder capitalism space that we're really pushing into, which is more purpose driven, and it's externally focused rather than focused internally about what we can do to make do less bad. It's what can we do to solve problems? How can we do more good, but in ways that are more profitable and create more resiliency? And that's the other kind of part of the stakeholder capitalism space that we work in. And unfortunately, when you get terms like sustainability and stakeholder capitalism, they get kind of perverted, and people decide to build an interpretation of what it means based on what they want to do. But the actual space is divided pretty well, I think, clearly between those that want to do more good at a profit, which are a smaller number, and those who want to do less bad at a cost. And when you do more good at a profit, then the initiatives that you're driving, the new business management initiatives, the innovations, they start to become profitable enough to be self-sustaining. And that's the prerequisite in our view for scaling up. And and scaling up is in itself the prerequisite for being transformational. So our feeling is that the only way you're truly going to transform business and the way business operates for the common good, but in ways that are good for business, is to make it good for business, to actually demonstrate that you can be more profitable, you can be more resilient, and you can have more growth by operating this way than by just chasing profit and trying to extract value from all the stakeholders that you work with. There's ways you could co-create value by solving some problems for your stakeholders.
yeah. Yeah, no, I really like that, and I can see the problem with with saying, how can we divert some of our profits for good? And staying with the question of what's the right amount of profit, the assumption being that by sacrificing some profit, we can do some good elsewhere. But they're really sort of saying the same thing, is that we take some of this profit and we put it to good. But that's still inside, if you like, of a financial capitalistic paradigm, right? We're still talking about profit as a financial
Exactly.
measure. And then it's about how do we use that money in different ways, right? It's still inside of that paradigm. Whereas what you're saying is, well, actually, that's just one facet of a much bigger, a bigger world, well, sort of, a bigger purview, a bigger scope of inquiry as to what it is this business is doing and the contribution it's making.
And Richard, I would make the point also that far from being incompatible with financial capitalism, all we're doing here is creating what we believe is a more complete form of capitalism that's contextualized for the conditions of the current global economy, where relationships that are based on trust, for example, and access through social media, that is valued very often more than money, than financial capital itself, because we don't have to buy and own everything that we want in this world that's so interconnected and so driven by social media. What we need is the ability to access the information we need to do what it is we want to do. We don't have to own that all the time. But how do you access that information? You do it with social capital. It has to do with trust, your social cohesiveness, your capacity to work collectively. Well, that is a form of capital that we've figured out how to measure, manage, and mobilize in ways that are as simple and stable and standardized as financial capital. And so once you start to realize that actually social capital has a lot more value vis-a-vis financial capital than you might have thought, because there's so much of a glut of financial capital in the global economy now, then you start thinking differently, and you start thinking more expansively about, well, how do we define performance? Is it just about a financial P&L, profit and loss statement, or can we create a mutual profit and loss statement where we also look at the fact that the more we create or deplete of social, human, and natural capital in any business activity has a direct causal relationship to our top and bottom line. So suddenly you can start to think that, hey, if I manage my non-financial forms of capital in ways that I grow them rather than just deplete them, by polluting a river, depleting natural capital, we can avoid some of the consequences that drag down our financial P&L, and we can create new growth and earnings opportunities. But I
Yeah.
don't want to leave you and your listeners with the impression that this somehow just a clever new way to make more profit for companies, because that's not where it
No,
started.
no, we're not saying we're saying that this is it's a much broader approach to
Indeed.
business. With
And it's also
well,
about healing. It's
yeah,
healing, and I like that word personally. I know a lot of people don't, but because they don't think healing is a particularly business-like term. But I think the relationship between part of the reason we're here today having this conversation is because the relationship between business and people has broken down. There's not a lot of trust out there, and I talk to a lot of business schools and I speak to a lot of MBA classes, and they're desperate to find something other than financial capitalism and socialism, communism. They want to find something else. They think there must be a better way, and many of them have the belief that companies are evil and somehow they're causing all the problems in the world, and they're not in a position to solve them. Our belief is that this broken nature of the relationship between business and people, and also the relationship between business and the planet is broken as well. Natural resources are often seen by business as a free resource, so they can leave a nasty environmental footprint behind, and there's no consequences for that or few. Well, our belief is actually that it's only business now, not government anymore, not nonprofits, that truly can help solve the largest and most challenging problems of society and the environment that are
mm,
out there today. But businesses need to realize that there's a better way of doing business, that there's a more complete form of capitalism that's driven by measurable impact, and that, we're already doing it, and we're finding, at a micro level, but a growing number of case studies that support the kind of work we're doing with different companies that we're working with, that we're finding that this is a superior form of value creation, what we call mutual value creation.
yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about it then. So let's talk about these. Let's just enumerate the forms of capital that you're describing and how we measure them, and then the leadership and management stances we then adopt in order to increase the value across those types of capital.
Right. Well, when you look at social capital, for example, which is, I'll start with that one because it's the most complex and yet we found actually holds maybe the most value of the non-financial forms of capital, although they all hold a lot of value inherently. And I think companies shied away from social capital, which has been around for over 100 years. There was a philosopher named Pierre Boudreau, who came up over 100 years ago with this idea of social capital. And when we started digging into it, we realized that there's somewhere between 60 and 100 different variables that you could use to measure a social capital space and explain it. And so we thought, okay, I see why it's so intimidating. Because what if you have a social capital space in one market where you use 8 to 12 different of these different variables, different metrics to measure social capital, but then in a different market, you have to use a different set of 8 to 12 variables. And so, we went in with some trepidation into trying to crack this, but we brought together some extraordinary people, including development economists and also probably the world's leading sociologist at the time, who's passed away sadly now, but his name is Peter Berger, an Austrian who then took up residence at Boston University. He was our resident sociologist, and we brought him in because he was such an extreme skeptic of quantitative survey instruments, because he was such a qualitative, sociologist. And so we figured if we could convince him that through a survey instrument, which is the only way that we could actually make this practical for business, because businesses don't have 7 years to sit in a community and observe social capital. You've got to do it in a survey instrument that's made robust somehow. But we partnered him with a guy named Alain Dedois from the Sorbonne in Paris, who is a development economist, worked with us for many years, and they really helped us crack this space and how to measure social capital with only 3 of these 60 to 100 variables that we found always account for about 70 to 80% of any social capital space in any circumstance, in any market, in any culture, developed, less developed economies. It didn't matter. That trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively were the 3 variables. And I'm so oversimplifying them, but that's because they're explained in a little greater depth. But those 3, if you keep those 3 in mind, trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively at a community level, that could explain about 80% of any social capital space. And we tested this, in the coffee fields of Tanzania and Papua New Guinea, in the cocoa fields of West Africa, in the distribution chain of Wrigley's chewing gum in Vietnam, in Paris and London. So we experimented all over the world in different markets, and we discovered no matter what we do, maybe they're weighted differently, but trust, social cohesiveness, and capacity to work collectively are the only 3 variables we need to pay attention to to make this relevant for business. And 80% is good enough to make business decisions. And so those 3 metrics are how we measure social capital. We have a survey instrument that we actually borrowed from. It was created in 1999 by the World Bank, of all places, to measure social capital, and then they didn't know how to use it, so they put it away, and that was it. And then we discovered this, and we modified it and improved it and automated it and so forth, and we made it much more useful. Moving over to human capital.
Well, actually, just so so trust. I can imagine. I'm just trying to imagine how this. But I can imagine in a survey, and inquiring into how much people trust each other, and presumably this is inside and outside the organization, whether they're, they're stakeholders
to look at communities. And so depending on the community, you really need to calibrate your survey instrument so you're asking the right kind of questions that can get at what does it mean to be trusting. So, if you're sitting in an office block in London, the variables may be, or the kind of questions you've asked about trust may be completely different than, you're out in West Africa and in a village of farmers, and basically the question has more to do with if you loan your cow to your neighbor to pull your plow, are you going to get it back, in good shape? There are different kinds of questions that you can ask, but we've done a lot of work in this to calibrate the survey instruments, and so we have a good understanding now, no matter where we are, of how to ask the question, and then when we get the answer, we do other calibrations so we understand what they're actually saying to us back. And that took a lot of work behind the scenes, but we now have that down so that it doesn't cost very much, it doesn't take much time, and we've built it into the means of operating as we automate more and more of the capability.
But in terms of the scope of this surveying of trust, it's how much employees within the company presumably trust the business itself, trust their management. It's how much customers trust the business. It's how much members of the community trust the business. Is that that the breadth of the?
We're looking at how businesses are operating in communities when you're looking at social capital. So rather than measuring the social capital inside the company, inside our own company, although we could do that with this instrument, we focus more on enabling the company to measure the level of trust, social cohesiveness, and capacity to work collectively in communities in which they're operating.
Right.
Because
Okay.
you then can gear your business model to actually create rather than deplete social capital. We found that there's a direct, it was initially a correlation, and that we were able to prove it later was a causal effect between how much you create or deplete of social capital and your growth and earnings, your top and bottom line.
Right.
And that was
Right. Right.
key to unlocking, being able to operationalize this as a business model, because it started to show companies that you can remove the trade-off of profit for doing some good. Because if you look at, building more trust in the community as something that's good, but it's not about making profit. If you look at those two things separately, then you're having to trade profit to create trust, right? But we
Yeah.
find that when you create trust in these communities, you actually get an outcome that benefits your top and bottom line. So you
Yeah.
don't have to trade it off, and that's absolutely revolutionary, I think, to
Yeah.
think that very different.
Yeah. No. But okay. But in essence, it's like, how much do those folk out there trust us? Right. How that's
Right,
what. Yeah.
exactly. And, let me give you an example. So let's say that you have a coffee business. This is an example I've used before. And in your coffee business, you have a plantation to grow the coffee, and then you harvest the coffee, and then you have to put the coffee beans out to dry along the bank of a water source. So it's typically done by a river, right? Well, there's a village on the other side of that river, and when the beans are sufficiently um, harvested, you wash them off with water you've collected from the river. So you wash all this acidity from the beans, and then you dump all that back into the water table. Well, what have you done? You've depleted natural capital. So you're becoming a net user of natural capital, and you're depleting it. Well, that polluted water now is also affecting the well-being of the human capital of people in that village. That's going down. Your natural capital is going down, your human capital is going down, and maybe the trust that that community has in your business across the river is also going down because you're polluting their water. Very simplistic example,
Yeah.
but
Right.
because these social, human, and natural capital, non-financial forms of capital, or have a causal relationship with your top and bottom line, they're acting as invisible drags on your growth and earnings. But you don't see it coming because you're only looking at your financial profit and loss statement because you're ignoring these other forms of capital. Well, what we're trying to do is really help companies realize that, hey, if you maybe introduce a new technology where you can clean the water before you dump it in the river, you're actually making the water table cleaner for those communities. So you're a net creator of natural capital. That has a follow-on effect of creating more trust and more social capital. It creates more human capital, and all these things actually benefit your company and can be connected to your top and bottom line as new growth opportunities. So this is where the doing good actually helps you do better from a performance level. If you,
Yeah. No. It
but it's
just reminds me
hard
of a
thing
story.
to, it's a hard thing for corporate leaders to initially grasp, because they're only taught financial capitalism, and then that's what they operate. And it's all about, how do we create an ecosystem around ourself and our profit, and how do we extract as much value from the stakeholders as we can. We're saying, let's decenter the company from that ecosystem of stakeholders. Let's put purpose in the middle, solving somebody else's problem. Then we have the right lens to populate the ecosystem with the right stakeholders, which is an expanded set of ecosystem stakeholders than you would normally have if you had, your company and its profit in the middle. And then you start to look at, and we have a capability called mobile ethnography to help surface the difficulties that these stakeholders are having that are impeding their performance in helping the ecosystem function optimally. And by helping the company devise maybe a strategy and intervention that's relatively low cost to solve one, two, maybe three at the most pain points of your ecosystem stakeholders, rather than just focusing on extracting value from them, you create a much more performant ecosystem helping you deliver your purpose. And it also brings about impact that also brings, you know, um, your top and bottom line benefits. It's just a
Yeah.
very different way of thinking.
Yeah. No. It just reminds me, as you're sharing, with a guest we had on the show who runs a recycling company. I think he's based in one of a city in the US, and he deliberately chose to put his recycling plant in one of the toughest neighborhoods to provide employment opportunities to people in this neighborhood. And he doesn't have a PR budget, but his PR is off the charts. because every journalist in the country wants to come and interview him and tell him what an amazing job he's doing and how he's managing to have this factory which never gets broken into and never gets graffitied right in the middle of this ghetto, basically. And it's just an extraordinary example of, by him consciously going out and doing good in that way, the as you say, top and bottom line benefits of doing that. So I'm not necessarily sure he's working within your framework explicitly, but he's certainly applying the principles.
Can I just give your listeners an example, like a practical business example? So we have a client that has kind of like a hardware store chain, a big one. In the US, it would be like a Home Depot or a Lowe's, but it's in Europe and it's one of the largest out there. Actually, we've done a case study on it. It's called Audio Leroy Merlin. So it's a French multinational, but basically, it's a do-it-yourself, a DIY kind of store, and they're all over the world, but especially in Europe. And we help them in a way that I think might be analogous to the example that you just gave, because we started to help them. Map out, or we mapped it out for them, their ecosystem of stakeholders around a number of their different outlet stores, their retail outlet stores in different communities. And one of the discoveries that we made pretty quickly was that where there was a breakdown in that ecosystem between two specific stakeholders, homeowners that wanted to do DIY work, they wanted to do a house improvement project, and so they would have to, buy the materials to do that at the client store, or at our client's store, and the handymen who would actually do the work. When the social capital and the trust was measurable as significantly higher than elsewhere between those two stakeholders, then you had a much more highly performant store. And before that, the people running those stores, they only looked internally at who was coming into the store and what was happening in the store. They weren't thinking about their ecosystem of stakeholders and those relationships among key stakeholders that were critical to the performance of that store. Equally, we found other retail outlet stores of that same chain where, when there was a breakdown of trust, when social capital was lower between the homeowners and the handyman, then the performance of that store was really lagging behind the others. So we helped them in a couple of ways, was, help create some interventions where the social capital was low, to grow the social capital between those two stakeholders and release more value creation for the store. But we also got them thinking about, well, maybe the next time that we have to decide where to put one of our retail outlets, we'll measure the social capital first, and we'll put our stores in places where we already have higher social capital between those two stakeholders, because we see the direct relationship between the social capital there and our performance in our stores. So that's just a small example of some of the kind of work that we can do. I can give you another one that's even better, but only if you're ready for it. I don't want to.
No, I definitely want to keep these samples coming, but I just wanted to close off on, especially for the people in there who have the, there may be a lot of listeners there, they have analytical minds. So what exactly are you saying, and how exactly do you measure it? So I think we've covered trust. The social
Oh, that's right. You wanted to talk about human.
So there's the work ability to work in collaboration and the social cohesiveness. So what do we mean by social cohesiveness, and how do we measure it?
Well, I mean, we do it through a survey instrument, and I don't think I could get into the level of details to tell you exactly what all the questions are myself, because we've got experts that really do. But social cohesiveness is another variable that we measure that's just as important as trust and the capacity to work collectively. And it really has to do with the makeup of the community. So there are some communities that where they might be relatively homogenous, whether it's tribal, whether it's ethnic, whatever it may be. And we find that when there's a greater level of cohesiveness, there's a greater level of trust, not surprisingly. And when we were measuring this in places like not Papua New Guinea, but in West Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, where there's a lot of history of different ethnic groups that are moving into to different communities, and there being a lot of ethnic tension and a lot of eruptions of civil war and violence over decades and decades. We have these cycles of violence and peace, violence and peace. A lot of it was tied to lack of social cohesiveness that came when tribal areas started to ethnically mix with one another in ways that were not constructive, and it broke down the social capital, broke down the trust between them, and there were problems in that space. So that's what I mean by social cohesiveness.
Got it. Okay, and then the third one would be ability to work collectively. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, think about when you have a problem in a community or a challenge. will your neighbors partner with you to actually find a solution to that problem? Or will everyone work in exclusion of one another? It's much you have a saying, and I keep using African expressions. That's only a small place that we work, but it's like if you want to make something really strong, a rope. You have three cords to it, and there's a reason that they think about that in terms of relationships. That if you want to have relationships that are really strong, that are based on trust, you have more than one or two people involved in it, and in a community it's pretty easy to quickly zero in on places where neighbors don't know each other, they don't care about one another, they
Mm.
don't look after one another if there's a problem, and then neighborhoods that are flourishing because they do.
Right. I'm just, well, the picture that comes to mind is those videos of the Amish when they lift up barns, right, together
Yeah.
and move them across the field.
Yeah, it's not a form of collectivism or collectivization, but it's a form of robust willingness to help your neighbor, knowing that if you've got a problem, you've got your neighbor there as a resource to help you, and therefore it lifts all boats. You always want to have more trust and collaboration. Think about a community that's harmonious, where your kids can go out and play in the park, and you don't have to worry about something happening to them because you know that you've got a network of neighbors that are also keeping an eye on your kids while they're looking at their own. I mean, it's something as simple as that. But there's ways that you can scientifically measure this and start to utilize it in a practical business way.
Yeah. No, good.
We'll
I
move to
like.
the other forms of capital because you mentioned human and
Yeah, no,
social.
no, I did it, but I wanted to go. I wanted to go through this thoroughly, and now it makes sense why it's revolutionary, right? You used that term earlier a few minutes back, and this is so far from what people get taught in business school.
Oh yeah,
Just,
oh
and we've
yes.
only been through one form of capital, right? This just does not. Yeah, how many MBAs are taught about the importance of increasing, the ability for your community to work collectively as a lever to improve business performance. It's so far, right, from the current paradigm. I don't
But
think
imagine if
it's an
businesses were
statement to
operating
say
this way.
revolutionary.
Imagine if businesses were operating this way. It
Yeah,
would be tremendously different how they were perceived by everyone else, and it would be better for business because if you looked at business as a force for good, actually, that was out there solving problems rather than just profiting by creating problems, I think you would be much more likely to be a consumer of their product, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah. No, no. Yeah, I absolutely see the connection. And I also cut you off with another example. So do you want to throw that in before we move to the
yeah, I
next
was going
form
to
of
give you
capital?
another example of just as how this works. Maybe I should talk about the other forms of capital first, though, so
Sure.
that because I'll use the other forms of capital in this example. But human capital is a different form of capital. If you think about, the two people forms of capital, social capital is measured more at a community level, and with those three metrics I mentioned, human capital is more about individual well-being in the workplace. Okay, so
Mm,
it's a different form of capital. It's about your well-being, and it's about assessing again, through data that can be acquired through survey instruments and through a lot of HR data that already exists, just evaluating it in a different way, we're able to find ways to identify in any corporate culture, because corporate cultures are different from one another and they attract different kinds of employees. So these metrics are not standard, whereas it's the methodology for collecting the data and evaluating that comes up with the metrics to measure human capital, depending on the cultural context. That's standard. Whereas in social capital, both the methodology and the metrics are standard. If you
okay.
understand,
Yeah, yeah, I see that.
what do you like
Yeah,
Mars?
yeah, the definition of well-being in investment bank is probably quite different to the definition in
What
a
we're trying to
nursing
get at is we're
practice.
trying to get at, people that work at Mars, we used to call ourselves Martians. I think they still do there. And the Martians there they care about certain things that give them well-being. And
Yeah,
because they chose to work at Mars and Mars chose them, they have kind of different values, different things that motivate them. And what we're trying to surface in this data analysis what are the sort of 5 metrics that could help you understand what the true drivers of well-being are of your workforce. And the way that this is connected to performance is that when you can surface what your workforce really cares about to have well-being, not only we discovered actually if you could address those key concerns in a meaningful way, that it would be like the equivalent of a 30% pay raise that you were giving somebody without actually having to give it to them. But even more important from a value creation perspective is that when you look at people, when you create more human capital in your organization, you get 3 benefits. One is you get talent attraction. So people want to work and they want to refer their friends to work at your company. Uh, and you wind up getting a better choice of the best and the brightest to work for you. So it has a big talent attraction benefit. Talent retention is also hugely impacted by human capital. When people are unhappy, when if they feel commoditized, when they're not connected to the purpose of the company that doesn't connect with their purpose, they feel like the company is not walking the talk of what it is they're saying they stand for. Their human capital goes down. And a lot of them leave, especially in this kind of market where people are more concerned about purpose than they ever were before. They're a little, and the social contract between the company and the worker has broken down. In previous centuries and decades, the worker had a pretty good feeling at a lot of companies that if they continue to work hard and do whatever the company wanted and they performed okay, that they would have a lifetime job. Well, we don't have that anymore. I mean, you don't know how the company is going to treat you as you go forward. So something needs to substitute for that if you want to be retained. And talent retention, when it's hemorrhaging, causes massive disruptions to the company's performance for a lot of reasons. And then the third area that impacts performance of human capital is optimization of your performance, because we're just finding that when people feel more motivated at work, not surprisingly, they perform better at work, and those are all things that benefit the company's performance as you go forward. So in the case of Mars, I'll just give you an example. We discovered that the number one. Well, first of all, I'll ask you a question. So out of the top 5 things that Martians valued in terms of their well-being, where do you think wage disparity was in the top 5?
3.
So how much money they made?
Yeah, 3, 2 or 3.
It wasn't in the top 5, not at all, because those were not the things that in that particular corporate culture people valued. The
Right.
number one driver of well-being for Martians turned out to be, do managers walk the talk of the values that they espouse? Because in that company, you've got 5 principles on the wall. Everybody knows what they are, and everybody talks about them when you make decisions. And if the company is not, is there, if they're violating their own principles, then the human capital is going to go down, and that's what people cared about the most. And then there were other variables as well that what was your relationship with your line manager that mattered a
Well,
lot.
that's a
What was
huge
your
one, isn't it? That's one of the
Sure.
biggest drivers of disengagement is relationship with
And
clients.
and what was something called the Poom effect, which means prospect of upward mobility, which had nothing to do with how much money you made. It had to do with how much responsibility that you were given in your job and how much freedom of action that you had to carry it out. So those were kind of like the top 3 of the 5 drivers of well-being for that company. Now, we may find if we're working with, Goldman Sachs, that wage disparity is up there somewhere, closer to the top, or another company might have different drivers of well-being. But the main thing to remember about this is that you can collect data and you can measure and identify what are the 5 core metrics you need to deal with that account for the vast majority of what people care about in that company. And once you do that, then you're armed, especially in the HR space, to start to create interventions to intentionally grow the human capital of your workforce with the expectation that you'll get performance benefits as a
Mm,
result through talent attraction, retention, and optimization of performance. So that's, again, very important to intentionally analyze, measure, manage, mobilize your human capital, just like your social capital in a business, and you're going to get performance benefits if you do that while you're creating impact,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then the third and last form of capital that's non-financial in nature is what they call natural capital or environmental capital in the literature. And if you think about how most companies deal with natural capital, they think about it in terms of your carbon footprint, right? And so that's an external benchmarking and reporting metric, and it's useful for some things. But as part of a business model, management innovation, operating model like economics of mutuality, which is what we call what we're doing, it's not as useful to look at external benchmarking and reporting mechanisms. We're more interested in driving management decisions in ways that create smaller footprints, create um, the means by which you can create more value by maybe maximizing the utilization of your natural resources in your production of whatever it is you're doing, and minimizing your footprint while you're doing that. And there's all different ways in which you can do that. But the main thing that we learned was that we partnered with a place called the Wuppertal Institute out in Germany, which is probably the leader in looking at this other school of thought in natural capital about, what do you look at how do you look at input metrics to drive different business decisions rather than output metrics, which are external and external reporting and benchmarking. And together we figured out that there were 5 there are 5 metrics that actually account for about 80% of all the natural capital that is utilized in anything, from the manufacture of a Mars bar that we talked about earlier, to an automobile, to a bag of
Mm.
rice. They're the same 5 metrics. They're not all actionable in every business activity, but when you can action one or more of them, you actually can have a significant impact on your utilization of natural capital and what you leave behind at the end. And so one basic example that I use, there was some early work that we did for Mars, is when they used to have a coffee business, and it was really small, so they could source coffee from anywhere in the world that they wanted. So we started to look at the value chains of coffee, and one of the ones we zeroed in on, and we did what's called a life cycle analysis of the value chain of coffee that was used in a what's called a Flavia machine, where Mars had this business where they had a single serve gourmet coffee machine called Flavia, and
Yeah, I've seen
packs
them. Yeah.
single serve packs of coffee that came from all over the world. But we looked at the Columbia value chain for the Columbia coffee pack. And these 5 metrics, by the way, were abiotic materials, biotic materials, soil, erosion, air, and water use, right? So again, not all of them are relevant for everything or actionable, but in the abiotic materials metric, we discovered through this life cycle analysis that something like 70% of all of the abiotic materials that were being created in this.
Abiotic, they're just non-biological. Is
Yeah, it's non-biological. Yeah, it's
minerals and
something that
yeah.
actually was non-biodegradable. So
Okay.
it was the non-biodegradable pack of this single-serve gourmet coffee from Colombia that was non-biodegradable because it was kind of aluminum, so that it would withstand the high heat of a single-serve, coffee machine system.
Mm.
But no one really looked much beyond that at whether there was a technology that could create a biodegradable pack. And by pointing them to that technology, you could address 70% of the abiotic material metric and become more resource efficient and create less of a footprint in your business model operating. So when you step back from all this, you say, okay, 5 metrics to look at natural capital, 5 metrics to look at human capital, 3 metrics to look at social capital. So we're only looking at 13 metrics. When you look at ESG, I mean, there are hundreds of metrics that they're looking at for compliance. So,
Yeah.
13 metrics is nothing to be able to manage 3 forms of capital. And those are the building blocks of our economics mutuality approach, because we find that when you measure, manage, and mobilize with intentionality to create more rather than to deplete social, human, and natural capital alongside every business activity you have, you would actually get an impact on your top and bottom line. Positively, if you're creating these forms of capital, negatively, if you're depleting them. It's that simple.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for going through all of that in detail. I really appreciated that, and I hope.
And you wanted that example, right? So I
Yeah.
said
Oh,
it's,
yeah. So that was one of the ones you haven't shared. Go for it. Yeah.
and I really like this example because it's really kind of dramatic in terms of the impact on ROI, return on investment, that this approach can have. And I don't want to claim that we can return the investment quite this high in every activity, but this was one real activity. When you're working with an economics and mutuality approach where you're trying to grow different non-financial forms of capital through interventions or to help stakeholders and an ecosystem around
Mm.
purpose, solve some of their problems, it's very indirect what you're doing. So when you get a question from a CFO, which is, okay, what's my ROI, for the investment we're making in this, it's a really hard question to answer,
Yeah.
and it requires a lot of cooperation with the business that actually allow you also to have control groups so that you can measure what you're doing against um, stakeholders that are actually receiving the benefit of the approach. And then you have to hold back some of the stakeholders that are in the same value chain, in the same business activity. You have to keep these benefits from them to see what happens to them. Companies don't want to do this. Managers don't have time for it. They don't have budget for it. They don't want to disadvantage anybody. But because at Mars, the CFO was really focused on, because Mars, this was birthed, economics mutual was birthed out of the company and is now independent, but that's where it came from. The Mars CFO really wanted to know, what is the ROI of a particular intervention? Help me understand how this works, what it costs me, and what it gives the company in terms of top and bottom line benefits. So he gave us a lot of cooperation. We were able to bring in control groups, and he helped us work with one of probably their real blue chip company. It's called Royal Canin, which is a nutraceutical pet food company that is very expensive, but it's very healthy for dogs and cats. So much so that they don't have to do a lot of advertising. Most of the advertising is done, in veterinary clinics called Banfield, which is also owned by Mars, and it's done by veterinary nurses, where people bring their dogs and cats in for ailments, and it gives the veterinary nurses the opportunity and the vets to say, hey, if you want to do preventive medicine, invest in buying your dog or cat Royal Canin. It'll cost more, but you won't have to come in here as often. They're going to
Yeah.
be much healthier. So it's a very interesting business to work with. Well, what we did was we helped them create an actionable purpose that could be delivered through strategy, which is really the first step when we're working with a company. So the company can have a purpose statement that is a value statement, or it's a statement about what they do that's not necessarily actionable. But when we're working with the business unit within the company, we want to help them craft a purpose that's externally focused. It's what's the problem they're trying to solve as a business. And one of the things I like to say when I first talk to a room full of CEOs to get their attention is I say, the purpose of business is not to create profit. And there's kind of a gasp. I say the purpose of business is to create profitable solutions to the problems of people, place, and planet, not to profit by creating
Mm.
problems, people, place, and planet. And then it's kind of like, aha, okay, now what do you have to tell me on this subject? Well, if you think about purpose that way, that it's been confused, and now a lot of business leaders think that the purpose is to make money. That is never the purpose of business. It's to solve problems profitably. Then you need to start thinking about, well, what are the problems that you want to solve profitably? So we helped Royal Canin come up with a purpose statement that was external and actionable as strategy, which was improving the health of all cats and dogs. Okay, and that
Mm.
fit in very nicely with the segment of pet care at Mars, which was a better world for pets, which is not actionable as strategy. It's more of a value statement. But the business unit that has to carry it out, how do we improve the health of all cats and dogs
Mm.
with what we to do that? You need to have a stakeholder ecosystem of partners that can help you do it, because you can't do it on your own. Your food can only go so far. So we put that purpose at the center of the ecosystem of Royal Canin, decentered Royal Canin and its profit, and put it as another stakeholder, mapped out who the right stakeholders would be to help Royal Canin actually deliver its purpose to create to improve the health of all cats and dogs. And we went about through mobile ethnography, interviewing the different stakeholders that we mapped out for them in an interactive way so we could surface what problems they were facing. We call them pain points in the ecosystem, that if they were solved in some way, that they would release significant value in terms of the performance of that ecosystem in delivering the purpose. If you're following me, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
in this particular example, just to cut to the chase, we discovered that there was a significant pain point in the ecosystem that was blocking value creation and really making it difficult for this this ecosystem of stakeholders around Royal Canin's purpose to deliver that purpose. And it had to do with veterinary nurses on the front lines in the veterinary clinics of Banfield. We found that those veterinary nurses actually were not trained properly. They were really demoralized, and they weren't performing well. They were attriting out of the system. So a lot of these clinics were understaffed very frequently. And then they had to keep trying to recruit and hire up. That had a lot of costs that were built into it as well. And we came up with an intervention that for a $6 billion company was not a big investment. It was like $250,000 to train 1,000 veterinary nurses to help improve all these things. And we found after this investment that there was an extraordinary result that came from this intervention, that came from mapping out the ecosystem stakeholders, identifying that purpose, identifying the pain points, and zeroing in on a particular pain point, and then solving it through a low-cost intervention of $250,000. We found that it created $4.4 million of bottom line benefits in terms of new revenues, new sales for Royal Canin. And on the top line side, we discovered that it created 11.2 million, I want to say, in top line benefits that had to do with arresting and reversing the attrition, having a higher motivated workforce, dispensing with a lot of other costs that come with that, having much more higher performing clinics because they were fully staffed with people that were trained the right way. So, 11.2 million top line benefit, 4.4 million bottom line benefit from a $250,000 intervention is about a 17x return on investment, right?
Wow.
Now, we're not going to get that everywhere, and it's going to be hard to prove the ROI. But after a while, it becomes self-evident to companies that, hey, you have enough of these examples where we believe that this is happening, and we're seeing performance increases when we're working with you. So maybe we should just go with them, and we'll build a bigger and bigger case as we go. So we're working on trying to create more of these examples, but that's another one that I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic.
So you don't have to sacrifice your profits to operate this way. Quite the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. So that makes complete sense at the level of the organization, sort of coming up to the level of society and the current, issues that we face, partly as a result of financial capitalism, the big inequalities and the problems we have in terms of young people being able to buy homes, for example. But there are all these tensions right now in society, inflation and devaluation of money, as we spoke to earlier. Um, I can absolutely see how this can improve uh, the community in which these organizations operate. It can improve the well-being of the employees. But at that structural level, is there still a risk that often of those profits that are generated by these more holistically grounded organizations sort of still get kind of hoovered up out of the system and don't necessarily um, solve some of those broader societal issues?
Well, I mean, if companies are actually operating in ways that are generating more impact that's measurable for society or the environment or both, then why shouldn't they make more profit? And how they
Mm,
use it, that's a different question. What we're trying
mm,
to do is ensure that profit maximization for shareholders alone that comes from extracting as much value as you can from the others is replaced by how do you co-create more value? Thinking of your ecosystem of stakeholders as there to help you deliver a real purpose that solves a problem for somebody else. And by helping them solve some of their problems, you can create more value for your business that's also providing more impact. So you can have it both ways. You
mm,
know, when we started this work, the only place that we could actually uh, work initially was in the slums around uh, Nairobi, Kenya. They're the biggest slums, the most impoverished in all of Africa. Places called Kwangwera and Kibera. Really, really difficult places to work. You don't see any financial capital there. You don't see any human capital or natural capital. You see a little bit of social capital because people that are living on the edge of life and death because of poverty, they tend to have to trust one another a little bit to have some social capital so they can live. And Wrigley's Chewing Gum was a company that had been recently acquired by Mars back then when we started this work. And it was the president of Wrigley's, a guy by the name of Martin Radvan, wonderful human being, who really was backing us and said, "Okay, I want you to experiment with this thing you call economics of mutuality, and do it in the one place in all of Africa that we have a factory, which was outside Nairobi, Kenya." And then the general manager there said, "I really love what you're saying, and it's really inspiring, but I have to deliver these really aggressive performance targets, and if I don't, more people are going to get their bonuses. So I don't want you to break what we're doing. So the places you can work are places we don't a demographic we don't reach. We don't have a business model to reach these people in these impoverished areas. So do you want to work there? That's your option." And we were a little intimidated at first, and we thought, okay, this is going to be really hard. But then we thought, if we really believe what it is we're saying to others, that we're discovering that you can actually intentionally grow social, human, and natural capital, and by so doing, you could release financial capital benefits as well. Then why not? Let's try it here in the hardest place in the world, and let's see if we can crack it. And if it works here, it's going to work everywhere. And so we created a hybrid kind of value chain where we discovered that you can't work in those areas unless you have social capital because the people are not trusting of big Western multinational corporations coming into their communities, and you can't get master distributors to take the risk of going in there when there aren't big supermarkets and other places to deliver to. That you have to hire locals and you have to train them because they're known. They have social capital with the little kiosks that sell products in smaller quantities. And so the point I wanted to make here was that, and we created a successful route to market business, but Wrigley's Chewing Gum, we were criticized, I remember, by in some places I talked to, by people who would look at this and they would say, "Okay, I understand what you're doing and you created all these jobs and everything, but you're selling chewing gum to with no nutritional value to people who are poor in these communities. How is that a good thing?" And I had to step back and say, "Look, you know, y- you you need to look at the bigger picture. That what did we set out to do? We set out to change the key performance indicators that businesses use to remunerate their employees from just financial capital from sales and earnings to non-financial forms of capital because we know that if people are held accountable through their what they call KPIs, key performance indicators, that's the metrics that their performance is evaluated on. if we can introduce these non-financial KPIs to the business and teach them how to grow social, human, and natural capital, we'll help lift people up out of poverty through the jobs that will be created. And actually, we're doing that. And we're doing it in such a way where that business is also making 2x the retained earnings of the neighboring business that's working with profit maximization approaches, master distribution, more brand recognition, wealthier consumers in the bigger cities. We're working in the slums area where we're providing employment opportunities for otherwise unemployable people because they don't have job opportunities. We're training them. We're growing their social and human capital. There was no natural capital aspect to that particular business initiative. And people are starting as people who are micro distributors of the product, and then they're graduating to people who have bicycles with baskets, who then have motorcycles, who then have a fleet of
Right.
motorcycles, that are hiring their friends. Then they're entrepreneurs. They have their own business. So we could see that. And there are things we can do to help them, like because we don't have to pay so much in the margin to the master distributor, we're using micro distributors. We could pass on more of the margin to them. So suddenly our jobs are looking better than other kind of jobs they can get. So the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter so much what the product is. It's what are you trying to accomplish? Are you doing good? You can't do everything. Would I like to have a highly nutritious, low price point product that's going to make everybody healthy in those areas as well while they're selling it? Sure. But you work with what you've got. And
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with selling chewing gum, and it makes people happy.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah. It's something I've enjoyed from time to time. Yeah.
Indeed.
Why not? It's a treat. Uh, the the other question I had is around private versus public businesses. So obviously Mars is private. I've had a number of leaders on this show who operate, if you want the one of the enlightened approaches to leadership and management. They tend to be from privately owned businesses, where they seem to have a lot more latitude in terms of their approach to leadership and management. Can this work when you've got a board demanding quarterly financial results and the maximization of profit?
We've been doing this for almost 18 years. And 18 years ago, we had these kinds of conversations. And my answer then was not the answer I would give you today. My answer then was absolutely. If we didn't have a company like Mars that was family owned, privately held, with shareholders that actually didn't take much of a dividend, it was all about the company and thinking long term and so forth, that we couldn't have incubated this approach and tested it sufficiently to be able to take it outside to other companies, other industries, and so forth. It's different now because we have a growing body of knowledge that's underpinned by real case studies that are coming out of real work with real clients across different sectors of the economy that are showing that this is a superior form of value creation, that mutual value creation actually can deliver, same or better retained earnings through impact than you would get if you were simply behaving more like a locust and trying to extract value from everyone in your value chain. That co-creation of value that creates measurable impact for others as well and solves problems, you'll be more profitable in the end anyway, and you'll have more growth opportunities in the end. And as we build this case, it either works or it doesn't. You either believe it or you don't believe it, but it's
Yeah.
evidence-based. I'm not coming in and asking people to take us on faith that this works. We're showing them how it's working and giving examples. We have case material. We have partners that can speak up for us that are business leaders as well, and that speak at our events that we run through our nonprofit as we go forward. So now I think this is something that's ready for publicly traded companies because ultimately, does it make sense to limit yourself to the measurement and mobilization and management of one form of capital when there's four, and all four forms of capital have a lot of inherent value? Or are you just, by following the old ways, squandering all of this value creation that comes from social, human, and natural capital?
Mm.
I would say that it's a no-brainer. And again, this idea of completing capitalism, I named our book, I co-authored a book with the chief economist of Mars called Completing Capitalism, Heal
Yeah, that's
Business.
the one I was listening to
Right,
just today.
that was
Yeah.
the first book we wrote on that. We since wrote another book called, with 30 co-authors. It's called Putting Purpose into Practice: The Economics of Mutuality, that Oxford University Press published a few years ago, and that is actually free if you go into our website, eom.org. You get a free download of the whole book. But we named this book Completing Capitalism very intentionally, and we found that actually it's something that elevates the conversation beyond politics and ideology. And this can be something that's equally appealing to, those on the left or the right, depending on where you're coming from. Because when I talk to people who are more on the left, I talk about this as being a more complete form of capitalism, and they're like, "Oh, okay, so you recognize it's incomplete, that it's causing this, it's causing inequality and other things." And yeah, and it can be made more complete, and that can actually heal a lot of the relationships that you're concerned about. And then when I go, over to talk to people across the street that might be at like the American Enterprise Institute or something, people that are all about financial capitalism, um, I can basically say something similar, which is, "Oh, you mean capitalism can become even better than it is now? It can become even more about value creation and become more complete." Yeah, mutual value creation will enable you to do that, and they're willing to engage. So we don't have to, associate ourselves with anybody when it comes to ideology. It's simply about elevating the conversation and saying there's another way to do this that makes more sense for the economic context of today. Why wouldn't you want to have a more complete form of your model that captures all the forms of value that are available to you and makes them available to not only your shareholders but also your stakeholders, who are essential to your shareholders making money anyway?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it makes sense to me. And in terms of the left right piece, yeah, I- specifically shareholder capitalism, there's a big reaction on the right that I see, especially online. This idea that what it really means is the state is going to get involved with businesses, and all businesses are going to be forced to take on large, you know, carbon reduction initiatives, and there's going to be a lot of coercion involved, and so shareholder capitalism is really just sort of state supervised capitalism is one reaction. And then of course the left very often are very warm to that idea, because okay, this is a bigger role for the state, which means that the voice of the people is going to have a greater say in business. And it's so I can see the appeal to the left. It's less easy to see it for the right.
And I just have to say, Richard, that one of the problems that I have with these big terms that include a lot of things is that they get used by different people however they want to use them.
Right.
Just like sustainability, it meant something very specific to Paul Pullman when he brought it into Unilever, and that was kind of
Mm.
like the big sustainability initiative. And then it took on a life of its own, and people just started using it to describe anything that they wanted to do. The same thing is happening to a phrase like stakeholder capitalism, and as I explained earlier, when we kind of broke the space down, I mean, I don't particularly care for the term, either, but it kinda makes sense to me because it's not leaving the stakeholder behind and recognizing that the stakeholder is germane to the shareholder, and his interest as well, and the shareholder has a responsibility to the stakeholder, but I don't find that it's right or left. And I think when people that you're saying are attacking this as somehow being, state controlled and Trojan horse, whatever it may be, they're confusing that with woke capitalism, I think, which is a kind of another term that's out there, especially in in the U.S. now. But I also see it out in Asia when I talk to business leaders out there, where they're thinking it's more about things that are compliance oriented, and then rather than about value creation, and that when you're bringing compliance in, it's like bringing in the stick.
Yeah.
You're gonna, have whatever it is, it's punitive. If you don't do this, and it's not necessarily going to create value for you or for anybody else. If you don't do this, then there's going to be a sanction against you. That's not a way to entice businesses to move forward and gain support. And so that's why I kind of drew a line between the part of stakeholder capitalism that's about things like ESG, for example, where ESG is maybe a way that people have gotten a raised awareness in different parts of the world about the need to do things that are more responsible. But it's purely compliance at the moment. So it's like carrying a stick around, and I'm finding that corporate leaders we interact with are becoming soured on that. And because ESG fits into the stakeholder capitalism space, then they start to merge that with woke capitalism, and then suddenly it takes on a life of its own, and it's just not accurate. Um, Really, if you start thinking about stakeholder capitalism more the way we're doing it, in terms of, how can you be more purpose driven, and through purpose, how can you do more good but at a profit in ways that are self-sustaining, scalable, and transformational? Then, why would that be more acceptable or unacceptable to the left or the right? But when you get stuck having to talk about something in a space that other people are defining and it's constantly moving, we almost
Can
need
see
another
your
term
point.
for it. But if we do get another term for it, someone's gonna just hijack it again. So That's where
Yeah.
I stand on this. It's not it's not left or right. I mean, it's what makes sense, in the current context, and also it's not new. You know, when you go back, when you think about something like this, you think, "Oh, wow, this is a real innovation." Well, maybe it's innovating, but it's innovating something that's based on a ground truth. And when you go back to that King Solomon quote I told you about in 950 BC, 3,000 years ago, one may one may give freely and still wealth will be increased, and another may keep back more than is right and comes to be in need. That's what we're talking about here. And that's something mankind has been wrestling with forever. It's not new. It's a kind of a rediscovery of a universal truth, and then you build a model on it.
Yeah. And
That's not political.
right. Right. And of course, when organizations were formed in the early stages of capitalism, that a business could not be disconnected from its community, right? There was no ability to not feel and see the impacts on stakeholders of their activities. Whereas now
Shareholder
businesses
capitalism,
can be removed, right? And
finan
so we're sort of reasserting that
yeah, financial
connection.
capitalism is a very new, very modern kind of thing, and it's only been around for 54 years. 1970s when Milton
Mm.
Friedman put it in the, New York Times, and then companies started to adopt it. Before that, there was no such thing. So, this is new, and the phenomenon unfortunately started for good reason. How do you address a scarcity of money in the global financial system? And then people started to modify it and identify it with greed. And, if you want to take from somebody else, you need to keep for yourself. And that's about value extraction. And that's a lie. That's not about how you create value and keep value. You can do it in a different way by
Mm.
helping your stakeholders help you solve your problems, meet your purpose. You create more value for yourself as well as floating their boats. It does work.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I've just loved this conversation. I think the breadth in which you're laying out uh, a a new perspective on capitalism is something I really appreciate, and the detail and the thoroughness with which you thought about how do we measure values in these different realms is impressive. Um, and I think what's different about what you're saying and uh, some of the other brilliant guests I've had on the show is that they're looking at one aspect of this. You're looking at all four simultaneously. You're really taking a sort of systems view again, which I appreciate. So yeah, I think you're
I
doing
appreciate that very much. And
great work.
I think we had an advantage, starting at Mars where we did, where we worked on the assumption that, we already knew the answer to the why question, why things need to change, why does the model need to be modified or improved or evolved or whatever you wanna call it. Um, we didn't have to spend all this time trying to, get people to realize that, "Hey, the system is broken. We need to create something new." Still, there are a lot of organizations out there that do wonderful things but that are still focused on trying to get people ginned up on why you have to make these changes. Well, we started with the assumption we have to make these changes, so we worked on the how do you do it piece.
Mhm.
That's where I think we, have a little bit of an edge. I love collaborating with, other organizations on this march because some of them are really they were very well aligned philosophically, and some of them are just really good at, convening the right kind of stakeholders. And, what they like about what we're doing, I'm told, is that we have the operating model, that have has practical it's underpinned by practical business case studies, and so this is something that we can bring to the table, and they can bring their stakeholders and their philosophy to the table as well, and we can help each other. So many of these organizations that work to advance so-called stakeholder capitalism, for lack of a better term, they work in exclusion of one another. It's almost like a competition and, on little islands. And one of the things I'm just determined to do in the roles that I blessed to have is try to break down those barriers and see where we can create other alliances to kind of co-create in a humble journey of walking side by side. And I'm finding good resonance to that message. That's why we're doing more with conscious capitalism. Raj is a friend. For example, Timothy Henry, one of the co-founders of conscious capitalism, just became the CEO of that organization, and I'm sure we'll be doing a lot more together in the future.
Brilliant. Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, and the way that you described your approach, it came through. Pulling in institutes with expertise, not trying to sort of build your own, but collaborating where it makes sense. Yeah, which is really, yeah, you're eating your own dog food.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what we say. I just told our leadership team the other day that when somebody used that expression, it came out of Mars for us. Or when we were working inside Mars, we would say we want to eat our own dog food. But when you're not in Mars in a pet food company, it doesn't work as well. I want to see if we can come up with a better food to eat.
And it comes from Mars, does it? I didn't realize that.
Well, no, it came for us from Mars. We used to say that all the
Oh,
time.
I see. Yeah.
The Mars is the largest pet food company in the world, along with selling chocolate. But we got to come up with something now that we're outside of Mars for the last 4 years.
I did not know that. Largest pet food
Yeah, it's
company in
my
the world. Yeah.
understanding. Yeah, it accounts for 2/3 of all of their revenues. But I love working
Oh.
with them, and they've made it possible for us to bring this outside to share it with the world because I think we were able to convince the family and the management that this is too big for one company and for one sector, and that we need to bring it to other companies, other sectors, contextualize it, bring back those lessons. So now we work with clients, in the technology sector and retail, in banking. We do a lot of work in banking. Have developed a lot of domain knowledge in that space, and
Well, man,
elsewhere.
if you could crack it in banking, yeah,
Well,
you've
we work with a very large
you
UK
have
bank
cracked it.
where we've done some really interesting work there and are doing more and more as we go. We're also working with a consortium of smaller banks in Scandinavia and with the largest bank in Singapore. So we're doing more and more. A new bank in Indonesia. So that's one of the spaces. But food and beverage, FMCG, those are spaces we have clients as well. And of course, Mars and food and beverage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you once again. Thank you, Jay, for giving me time. Yeah, for really going through the detail here. I appreciate that. Um, and all the great stories. Yeah. Godspeed, as they say. Yeah, this I can't wait to get this out here and out into the world. And yeah, let's hope more leaders latch onto this, resonate with it, start taking this approach.
Well, thank you, Richard. Ignorance is one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome. That people just don't realize that there actually is a better way, and that we're teaching it at some universities where we're operating like this with different companies. But I don't think there's enough visibility yet, or the fact that there is something here that's tested, that's underpinned by case studies. So people like you are playing a critical role, and I really appreciate you letting me speak to your audience. Thank you for what
Thank
you
you.
do.
Thank you. Yes. No. No. Really. And I think again, what you bring to the party is there's a growing number of case studies that talk about the the people first agenda within organizations and how focusing on that has has huge impacts in terms of financial performance. Less so on the full ecosystem piece, and that's what I really appreciate your message about your message. Yeah, great. Okay, so again, where can people find the material? Where's the best place to send them?
I think the best place to start is our Economics and Mutuality Alliance website, which is eom.org. And at the bottom of that website, there's 4 other links to websites of our 4 constituent organizations. One is called the Economics and Mutuality Foundation, which I lead and is more about the transforming business education on the front end piece, and also orchestrating the right stakeholders around these what we call meaningful challenges that help drive purpose and commercial interest. If businesses can solve things like aging demographics, like deforestation, loneliness, these are all issues we're working on. Financial inclusion. We're working with companies, but we're using our nonprofit to actually bring together the right stakeholders, raise the awareness, and drive this forward. And then we've got that organization owns a for-profit company. It's a nonprofit, but it owns the for-profit Mutual Value Labs, which actually deploys this to businesses and builds those case studies. We also have a Human Flourishing Foundation that's part of the alliance that owns our private equity arm called Mutual Value Investments, which is trying to change the way financial capital is deployed in investing, actually applying a lot of these principles and some digital tools we're bringing into play as well.
So
If
for
they want to
any
know more, have a reach out. And our books I mentioned before, Completing Capitalism is one where kind of lays out the whole philosophy behind this, and that's easy to find on Amazon. And then if you go on our websites, you could find case studies, but you can also find the free download of Putting Purpose into Practice: The Economics of Mutuality, published by Oxford University Press, which is more of the how do you do this with
yeah,
chapters on measuring different forms of capital, doing an ecosystem analysis. So those are good places to start. No, you can always reach out to me as well.
and it's eom.org.
Yes, sir.
And it's in terms of reaching out to you, you're on LinkedIn. Is that the best place?
And the
J Jacob.
best place is LinkedIn, but you'll also be able to reach out to me through our website.
Right.
If there's a place you can send a query and it'll come to me if you want to talk to me.
Brilliant. Okay, Jay, thank you once again. This is
Have a great day.
very inspiring, very energizing. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Me too. Take care.
Thank you.